There you go.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on the use of privacy frameworks. There's our notice that we're being recorded. And I'm Katy Ruckle, the state's Chief Privacy Officer, and I'm joined today by Matt King of our office and Jenn Behrens. She is going to do an introduction of herself and cover part of the information that we're going to share with you today. So just as a quick overview on today's presentation, let me advance the slide here. We're going to cover privacy frameworks and maturity model landscape. We're going to talk about the Washington Privacy Framework goals, introduce the framework that we've developed and its uses and implementation, and then how it can be used when you're building a privacy program. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jenn. So Jenn, go ahead and introduce yourself and a little bit about your background, and we'll get into your slides.
Great. Thank you, Katy. It's nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation to share information about the privacy framework landscape with everyone. Again, my name is Jenn Behrens. I'm partner and executive vice president of privacy and security for a consulting company called Communi. We provide privacy, security, and identity subject matter expertise and consulting. We've been working with OPDP for, I think, a little over a year. In a previous life, I was a foster care social worker with local government and state government agencies, and so very much appreciate working with government agencies and all the work that you all do, while also attempting to hold information in a privacy-enhancing manner. And since transitioning into the wonderful world of privacy, I have fallen in love with all different sorts of aspects and really find a lot of delight in figuring out how to use different frameworks and different approaches to further privacy programs and privacy practices. So again, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to present this information. And with that, we can go to the next slide. So I have 3 slides, I believe, to show you on different framework aspects and approaches. I will start by saying the Fair Information Practice Principles, more commonly known as the FIPS, which were codified in the 1974 U.S. Privacy Act, are known as the seminal set of privacy principles or the foundational privacy framework that nearly all frameworks across the entire world are based off of today. So if you look at any different regulation or framework for privacy, even in APEC or in South America, you will see flavors of the FIPS in there. So it's a really great set of foundational principles. The downside, as I say, the FIPS are beautiful. They tend to be a bit squishy. They are principle based, so it's hard to measure against them. And so when we look at those, we're often looking at alignment and not necessarily scoring. NIST has provided some different levels of privacy standards, and one that is more commonly known can be articulated or found through NIST Special Publication 853. This was traditionally mostly a security standard. Those of you that are familiar with previous revisions know that all the privacy standards used to be shoved in the back in something called Appendix J. So if you hear privacy people talk about Appendix J privacy, that's where all the privacy controls for 853 were located. In this local last revision cycle, they did integrate the privacy controls into the main document. However, I will say the document tends to still read very security centric. It can be mapped to other standards and frameworks, such as the NIST Privacy Framework, which is really handy. It does also serve as the backbone for a lot of different requirements for regulations and standards, including MARZ, IRS Publication 1075, ACA. So it's really a very helpful standard to understand. If you're looking more at compliance schemas, there are 3 that are primarily well known out there for organizations to use, and a lot of government agencies will actually use the Privacy Maturity Framework out of the AICPA. This is formally known as the Generally Accepted Privacy Principles, or the GAP. And this uses a 5-point scale called the privacy maturity model for scoring and ranking. This can be conducted as an internal or external audit, and it does map to the SOC 2 Type 2 Privacy Trust Service criteria, which is the next type of audit compliance schema. This looks at and considers personal information that's collected, used, disclosed, disposed of to meet the organization's objectives. So it's how well does the organization put privacy into place in the context of the business purpose it has. So it's really more of a contextual audit. Also, to call out, a SOC is an audit and not a certification. If you are looking for a certification, ISO 27701 does offer a certification to look at how well controls are implemented in a privacy information management system. This can also be referred to as the PIMS. Of note, as of right now, the only way to get certified in 27701 is if you first get certified in 27001, and then 27701 could be an extension of that certification. Two additional ways to think about frameworks for privacy include Dan Solow's taxonomy of privacy. This is a really nice approach to looking at cataloging harms to individuals that could arise from privacy risks or infringements. And it's really the seminal, it was originally an article, but now it's been transitioned into a book about cataloging these harms from an individual's perspective. NIST utilized this taxonomy in the development of their privacy risk assessment methodology. And it is a very highly referenceable taxonomy of privacy, looking at, again, the harms that could be impacted or felt by individuals if there were certain privacy restrictions in place by agencies. Alternatively, you can look at a risk management perspective from an organization's lens. The two ones that I want to call out here are the NIST Privacy Framework. This was developed as the sister to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It utilizes the same 5 functions that you have in the Cybersecurity Framework, or the CSF: identify, govern, control, communicate, protect. And from there, you have a cascading series of categories and then subcategories. In the privacy framework, you have 100 subcategories that you can measure against. And they do use you can use a measuring stick on this. Of note, these are implementation tiers. This is not designed to be a maturity model, which can be a little bit of a mind twist, because it is on a scale of 1 to 4. But your organization does not necessarily need to try to get to a 4 to be a fully functioning and privacy program with good practices. You could be fine at a 1, you could be fine at a 3. So in order to determine the level of risk and how to make decisions based off of that, using the privacy framework, you do an as-is assessment, which is called a current profile. Then you look at the target profile, which is where you want to be in for, say, let's say a year, and you develop a roadmap on how to get from your current profile to your target profile, looking at which implementation tier you would like to adjust. Another tool in risk management for privacy is called it's from NIST 8063. This is NIST privacy engineering model that they have codified in this document. It's based on a privacy engineering discipline using predictability, manageability, and dissociability as their privacy triad. This triad, again, predictability, manageability, and dissociability, which will never come up in Word as being an acceptable word, is NIST's version of the sister to the security triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The NIST 8063 is very granular, so it gets very deep in the weeds in privacy engineering. It does provide a scoring of risk based off of a 4-point scale, and then a series of activities how to identify which ones to mitigate and remediate and which risks to accept as a business risk in moving forward. It's great to use if you have a system or solution in which you have identified privacy risk out of something, for example, called a privacy impact assessment or PIA. So it's a great tool. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are some sectoral frameworks out there in privacy. HIPAA is my personal favorite, and I often say that HIPAA is our vinyl record of privacy regs in the federal government. We have had the HIPAA privacy rule around since '96. It is really a quite beautiful regulation if anyone ever wants to read it. It does govern health information generated by covered entities. So this is of special note. It's not health information that is generated or provided by consumers or organizations that are not governed by HIPAA. So if you're thinking about a lot of these mobile apps or Fitbits these days, Apple Watches, that information isn't necessarily governed by HIPAA, even though you may think of it as health information. So just some nuances to think through as technology is outpacing some of our historical regulations. There's also FERPA, which applies to student education records and the protections that students and families have with those records and that information being shared or disclosed. And then we additionally have COPPA, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which really specifically focuses on the information that may be collected and processed for children under the age of 13 online or through websites. It's really designed to make sure that parents are involved in that consent process and know what their children are doing and how information that may be collected about them is being used and then potentially pushing information back to them. So everyone, I'm sure, is aware of TikTok and the Facebook kind of scandal of late about information being sent to children and how that was providing some potentially harmful information. And so this comes into play when considering how to protect the privacy rights of younger people who may not be in a position to make informed decisions about what information they're accessing or receiving. So that is a high-level overview of several different types and approaches to privacy frameworks.
Thanks so much, Jen. And it would be wonderful you could stay on with us for the rest of the session in case there's questions that come up about some of the background and models that you've shared.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we're going to turn over and talk about some of the framework goals, and Matt's going to cover this piece for us.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jen. That was a lot to think about there. On this next slide, you really have this attempt that many of you have seen before to kind of organize some of the different concepts that Jen was talking about and really highlighting the idea that just following the law isn't enough, that you really do have laws and regulations that you really need to comply with, but then getting beyond that to try to consider principles and what you should do, and then beyond that to privacy frameworks, which we tend to think of as kind of like the skeleton or structure for your program, and then ultimately to maturity models. So not just the structure, but how well you're doing each of those pieces. As we heard Jen talk about things being measurable. So right now, I think over the past couple of years, we've seen agencies get a lot better at the compliance function, and they're really moving into that principles-based idea. But we're still not seeing a lot of framework use. A very small number of agencies are using some of the resources that Jen is talking about, and we're seeing some that use some of those sectoral laws as their framework. But for the most part, folks are using or implementing pieces of those frameworks, but not really the overall structure or thinking about it holistically. So we really approach this work wanting to move agencies farther towards a more formal framework that helps document activities and make progress over time, and make sure that we are having consistent decisions so that even in agencies that have robust privacy programs, that we're moving privacy from something that a person knows how to do to something that the agency knows how to do. So as we approach this work, we certainly wanted to stay consistent with industry standards, many of which Jen just went through. But what we were finding from talking to people is that a lot of it is just overwhelming for the types of resources and the maturity level that agencies are currently at. That you can pick them up if something sounds like a great idea, and all of a sudden you pick up the NIST privacy framework and it's 30 pages and you're like, I have half of an FTE to do this. No, and you just move on. And even once you get into the details, they can be a little bit confusing and sometimes repetitive. Again, going to the NIST privacy framework as an example, you have those 5 functions. Policies and procedures shows up in 4 of the 5 functions, which I think takes some time for people to get their head around, like how you're actually supposed to implement that. And it also goes beyond things that we often think of as pure privacy functions. There's a lot of data governance activities, a lot of security functions. So we really want to focus on those privacy core activities. But at the same time, we wanted it to reflect those standards to make sure our bases are covered, to make sure that it's familiar to other partners who are familiar with those standards, especially with NIST, where we have a lot of cybersecurity expertise, that keeping some NIST language in helps it understandable to those folks. And then overall, we just wanted it to be approachable, something that you could look at and feel like you can implement and not immediately stop before you even get started. We want it to be scalable to different sizes of agencies who may have different levels of complexity, different sensitivity around the information they have, and then flexible. So agencies don't have to implement it as we have drafted it, and then also so we can update and enhance it over time. So with kind of laying the groundwork of the goals, I'll turn it over to Katy to introduce the framework itself.
Thanks, Matt. So we did build a Washington privacy framework, and it's based on the NIST privacy framework. But I think what all of the background, you can see the complexity and depth that you can get into very quickly with a lot of these frameworks and laws and models. We boiled it down to what we think is a more approachable and implementable way for agencies, especially early in their privacy program development, to think about. And so it is based on the NIST privacy framework. And so if you have the time and energy and resources to dig into the NIST privacy framework on, all of the functions and categories and subcategories, we do not want to stop you from doing that. But if you are at a place where you need to start at a little bit of a higher level, that's what this framework is meant to be for our Washington state agencies. And so we're going to walk through what the actual framework is that we developed based on the NIST privacy framework. Our team got together and talked about what we thought made sense for our state. And so just quickly, it's just 3 pages. That's where we're going to start. And these are the actual functions that we identified as making the most sense for us to start for several of our programs in Washington. And I really like this model that shows, the 5 areas, which are identify, govern, protect, communicate, and respond, because you can really start with any one of them at any point in time, although it does go through in a little bit of a linear model. But I just wanted to share this diagram as a way to think about it, that you may be a little further along in maybe your protect area or your govern area, but you may need more development in some of your communication plans. There's no right way to start. And so but we are going to still go through starting with identify, which is also similar to the NIST privacy framework.
Okay, so we're gonna walk through what the different components are of the framework. And just since this is the first one, I'll highlight that the overall structure is just that we have the function over there on the left-hand side. We have a simplified task, and then in the right column we have the outputs, the alignment, and the resources. So in the outputs, you can expect a description of what type of kind of end product you should have if you're doing that activity successful. We've tried to identify where there's direct alignment with the NIST privacy framework, where there's alignment with our Washington State Agency privacy principles, and then we've also added other OPDP resources that have already been created around that specific task. So looking at identify first, you'll see that there are just 4 of them. The first is understanding what, how, and why data is collected, used, and disclosed. So the idea here is just that you need to have a basic understanding of how what data is collected, how it's collected, and the reasons it's collected, and how it's expected to be used. And that's really essential information to help with all of your later activities, including data minimization and limiting uses to the original purpose it was collected, to monitoring appropriate use, responding to incidents, kind of the whole gamut of stuff that comes later. So at a minimum here, you should have systems inventory that include the types of data, what that system is used for, your Washington State data classification, and who is responsible for the system. And those inventories shouldn't be a one-time thing. They should be continually updated and reviewed to ensure accuracy. So the next one is understanding the applicable laws, principles, and norms. So obviously knowing what data you have is helpful, but again, not super helpful unless you also know what laws apply to that information. So we heard Jen go over some of that, like at the federal level where you have your FERPA and your HIPAA and your COPPA. At the Washington State level, we have lots of public records exemptions and other specific laws that apply to particular types of information. And then even beyond those laws, we want to make sure that you're understanding the norms and principles that may apply to that information. So for example, if you're talking about race or ethnicity or citizenship status, or information that's used as part of an automated decision-making system, that even if there's not a specific law that applies to that, those are categories where we know there is some heightened scrutiny, and you should be thinking carefully about how you use that information. And the next slide here has the last 2 in identify. The first is to understand your agency mission and the operating environment. So as we often talk about, to be effective, privacy needs to work as a business enabler so that you're meeting business objectives while maintaining strong privacy protections and not treating it as a one or the other thing or just a compliance function. And to do that, you really need to understand the agency's overall goal so that you're aligning your activities with that goal, and you're also understanding roles and responsibilities. And that's also going to help you demonstrate return on any investments in your privacy program so you can continue to strengthen your efforts. And then in terms of identifying sponsors and advocates and partners, you know, privacy is multidisciplinary and we can't do this on our own. So you need to identify who your champions are and build relationships to make sure you're not going it alone. And this can come in all kinds of different flavors. It could be something really formal, like charters to set up and govern a program at the beginning, to things like combining resources for priority projects, or even just making sure that you're having routine check-ins with your counterparts and really maintaining those strong relationships across the agency.
And the next function is govern. And so you'll notice that we have created a slide with all of the pieces of govern, and then we're zooming in on each one of them, which is what the little magnifying glass signifies for use of the slide deck later. So establishing your agency commitment and assigning privacy responsibility is part of the governance function or govern function, and this also is similar to some of the NIST framework. It's very difficult to have a privacy program if you don't have any individual in the organization that has any responsibility that's a dedicated part of their position. So you may not have enough resources to have a full FTE, or it may not even be necessary, but really for establishing some sort of I would say base level for the organization, you really need at least a point of contact to be able to start that organizational support and privacy responsibility. So Matt also mentioned the privacy policies and procedures are in 4 of the NIST framework, or 4 of the NIST functions, and we have talked about those quite a bit in terms of aligning your policies and procedures with the Washington State Agency privacy principles, and we are still working on assisting with different models and policies that may help in those areas. And several agencies already have policies and procedures, but this really falls into so many, as you can see with the alignment side of the screen, as a really fundamental part of your privacy program, because without the policies and procedures, your agency staff are not going to understand the interconnection in terms of what their responsibilities are around handling the data. So the next piece is monitoring and reporting on metrics. So we have done a webinar, and that's linked in our resources here on metrics. So once you get a little bit further along, you can set your metrics and what you want to measure in terms of figuring out the maturity of your privacy program and how you want to report that, especially to your agency leadership about where you're at. You may start at ground zero, and that's okay, but identifying where you are in terms of your program and your performance and your metrics helps to then give you something to work towards to build your maturity model. And of course, once you've set your baseline and started your reporting and your performance pieces, you need to be continually monitoring and reviewing any changes or collections in your data handling procedures, your data practices, if systems are being updated to collect different information. Those types of pieces are all part of your governance process to determine if your agency is still keeping in line with its policies and procedures and meeting all of the applicable laws and requirements for things that change. So this is really just to recognize that privacy is not a one and done exercise. It's not a simple checklist and then you can say, okay, I've addressed privacy and I don't need to think about it again. It's really, it's a program, it's not a project. It's an ongoing exercise, and that's why the governance function is an important part of your framework.
Okay, so that gets us to the protect function. There are 4 here again, and so let's go forward to the zoomed in version here, Katie. Okay, so the first one is quite simple: conduct privacy risk assessments. So really what we're talking about here is privacy impact assessments, which we have had a separate webinar on, so we won't go into a lot of detail today, but in short, just that those assessments help create a formal structure to identify privacy risks. They make sure you're identifying risks to individuals, to people, and not just to the organization. And they also give you a structure to get privacy considered early on enough to meaningfully mitigate risk, and you're not trying to bolt privacy on at the end. The next one is exercising due diligence before and after sharing data with third parties. So this is another one where we have done a lot of outreach and provided a lot of guidance on, including other webinars already, but basically we're talking about the whole bundle of processes to understand where your data is going, to vet both potential recipients of the data and the reasons for sharing and the authority for sharing, entering appropriate data sharing agreements with those third parties, and then monitoring them over time. The next one is implement security safeguards. Again, one that we have done a webinar on. Apparently, we have focused a lot on the protect function, but the idea here is just, again, that we need to work with IT and cybersecurity teams, and that includes making sure that there are appropriate security safeguards in place. And then the last one in protect is making sure that we're getting rid of data that's not needed anymore. So we're only keeping data for as long as it's needed to fulfill its original purpose, unless there's some other requirement or new legal authority for additional uses or keeping it. And then when that period comes up, when it's no longer needed, that it is disposed of with appropriate approved methods.
Thanks. So the next function is communicate. And this one is fairly straightforward, but can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes, which is why we have tried to create a lot of training for agencies. And we, as many of you know, just released the privacy basics for state employees. So that is in the Learning Center, that is in DES if your agency is interested in launching that in your agency. Or if you haven't made it available through the Learning Center, it's also available on our website. You don't get to actually take the knowledge checks and get a score, but you can just take the training that's on the website, and it's 33 minutes. So it is not a burden to take, in my opinion. But that's just one piece of the communicate is the training. You also need to conduct awareness activities, and that can lead to some of the other events we do in January when we talk about Privacy Week. And we've just had a lot of awareness activities and great examples of that with the Cyber Awareness Month, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, with all of our Hacktober activities. But that's part of helping people recognize that privacy is an ongoing discipline that needs constant care, love, and feeding in terms of making sure that the agency is using data appropriately and as expected and following those privacy principles. And we have our meetings and webinars to help conduct some of the awareness for the state. And then the other piece that's, of course, fundamental to privacy, and we see these so frequently, even today, you know, starting the webinar, it lets us know we're recording. But the privacy notices, there's the actual website privacy notice that most agencies have or should have on their websites. And then there's also the privacy notices that you may have on your website that talk about how the agency actually collects, uses, and handles personal information from the clients and customers and residents of Washington. And those are all part of course, our transparency and accountability principles, but is also fundamental to the communicate function.
And the last function is respond. And we've just identified two key pieces that are going to be a big part of any privacy program on an ongoing basis. So the first is about receiving and responding to requests for individual participation. So that is going to vary quite a bit from agency to agency, depending on the function they're performing, but it could include things like requests for access to information, modification, deletion, restrictions in user sharing, and it also include things like consent management or opting in or opting out of specific types of uses or specific types of sharing. And so for all of these, agencies should understand what types of individual participation are appropriate and under what circumstances, have policies and procedures to receive and respond to those requests, and to make sure they're monitoring and tracking requests to make sure the agency is making timely and appropriate responses. And then the last one is about incident response. So this is going to include everything from initial identification of incidents to reporting them to the appropriate folks in your agency, responding and investigating, making breach determinations, and notifying affected individuals if necessary. So when you're doing this, you definitely want to be sure that you're really clearly defining roles and responsibilities, and you're conducting training and awareness that's consistent with that, so people understand what their role is. Especially, this is one that expands to all staff, that everybody in your agency has a really critical role in identifying and reporting potential incidents. So before I turn it over to Katy to talk about really using this for program development, I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the different ways that you can use this and why you should be considering a framework. A lot of this is consistent with what Jen was talking about, so I won't spend a lot of time, but at a really basic level, you can do a gap analysis to figure out what you have in place. If there are big gaps based on how high level this is, it should be pretty easy to identify them. You can use it to identify risks and opportunities. But even beyond that, I'd really encourage you to use it as an opportunity to document and take credit for existing activities. It's really helpful to be able to communicate what you're already doing and not just the things that you're not doing, and it'll help you get buy-in. But you can also use it to set targets for improvements. Take credit for what you have and acknowledge where there's room for improvement. And the fourth one about communication, I think, is really important. I think when you just have like policies that are standalone, or components of a framework without the overarching structure, it's hard to talk up and down your organization. And having something like this really helps you communicate consistently with a wide range of people, and is a big part of what I mentioned earlier about making privacy something that your agency knows how to do and not just something a person knows how to do. And then the last bit is just to highlight that we are going to be developing supplemental guidance. So although this is very high level, we know that some folks will want more detail, and we'll be continuing to develop and refine that over time. We have just a couple of examples of some of the initial guidance, which again is really more of a narrative description of what the considerations may be in implementing these particular tasks. So this is one that goes into more detail about that identify what data you have function, and gets into what should be in a data inventory and how that should be collected. The next one is about establishing agency commitment and assigning privacy responsibilities. So in this one, we talk a little bit more about the idea of choosing kind of the organizational structure for your privacy program, where so the example in here is if you have an agency where or where you have a lot of functions that are centralized, it probably makes sense to have a centralized privacy program. If you have an agency that works through large administrations where things are a little bit more federated, you probably want to mirror that, do whatever makes the most sense to make you effective in your particular agency. And then the last example here is about awareness activities. And again, just going into a little bit more detail about the difference between training and awareness. I feel like they often kind of get bundled together, and they definitely are different things and have different goals.
Next, we're going to try and tie it together with the building the privacy program. So once again, here is the privacy framework functions. And for thinking about privacy program development, and especially, normally you can start anywhere, but I would say also the NIST privacy framework starts with identify and govern as the first two steps. And for the privacy program development, if you haven't started anywhere, I would say, look at and identify the roles in your organization that are already central to data management or data governance. And that can be, legal, risk, information technology, security, records, which includes retention management, or, the public records officers, data or information governance, administrators, other compliance roles, and there may be others I'm not thinking of in your agency that work on this, but this really comes to asking yourself in terms of if you want to develop a program, can you identify, a quarter FTE, half FTE, somewhere to just start at a very high level to think about what that would mean for your agency. And so some initial questions you might ask yourself is, does your agency have an identified privacy officer? The title of privacy officer may be less important than the job duties that are responsible for it. And oftentimes, even if you don't have a privacy officer, you have an incident response plan, or your agency has an incident response plan should information be breached, or there's some sort of cyber event. And maybe look at that plan to see who is in there, and do you have the right roles in there? If it's just your chief information security officer, might not be enough. You might want to think about adding other roles to your response plan, and then think about building off of that team. Because if you're starting, if you haven't started anywhere, I think in terms of, we mentioned the great shakeout today and being prepared. If you have your incident response plan, and even if you're at a very, very superficial level for where you're starting with your privacy program, a lot of times where I have started with agencies that come to me when there's a crisis or there's an actual incident is, gathering those folks and then starting having conversations about what it might look like at your agency. So that really just gives you some place to start if you haven't started thinking about that already. And part of what we've talked about already in terms of how privacy is interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, you can also look at your other data handling policies, and how, thinking about how do you have a time limit on reporting incidents? I would say, best practices are 24 hours if possible, but maybe you have less time or more time, depending on applicable laws. What training do you already have around data and confidentiality? If you know you're using those records, I think Matt made an important point about taking credit for what you have already, and you may not have been thinking of these things in terms of being a privacy program, but they really are parts of it. And so you really should, without reinventing the wheel, take credit for what you have and then build from there. You may also have things like non-disclosure agreements that you use with your employee about how they're handling information, and think of additional training or information around that. And then, of course, I'm going to touch on the privacy principles as a foundational element in a minute. So when you're looking at the program development, this is what I've talked about in terms of look at the positions you already have, look at the policies you already have, think about which data and start with the data that needs to be protected. Build the community with the resources that you have. If you have an incident response team, maybe think about having regular meetings and training to build the expectations and culture, and then build out from there with the expertise. And of course, our office is a resource for that. We encourage you to reach out to us, or encourage other people from your agency that touch on these issues to attend or see some of the trainings that we put out there and resources. And I'm just going to show really quickly that all of these things actually intersect with the privacy framework functions that we've talked about. So, positions and policies go with the governance or govern function, looking at identifying the records that you need to protect, starting with the most sensitive information. Doing data maps and data inventory is a very resource intensive exercise, but when I have heard other professionals talk about where to start, it's, a little bit of biting the elephant, eating the elephant one bite at a time, but think about starting with your most sensitive data first, right? And so build out from there, because that's where the highest risk is in terms of privacy risks come from. And then, of course, once you have your resources identified and your teams built, you can look at the communication function. Of course, you're protecting that data. You already have response with incident response, and then also using the privacy principles that can help as a starting place and aligning your current agency missions to identify the applicable laws and data sets that need protection for what I just talked about. And we have a link for our privacy principles if you're unfamiliar with those on our website as well. And there's also additional training about that. So I feel like we covered a lot of material quickly today. I want to thank everybody for their attendance. And at this point, I want to pause and find out if there's questions about any of the material we covered for Jen, Matt, or I. So thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna look in the, so Angie asked clarification the OPDP privacy training isn't an open training in LMS. So that's correct. So the privacy training, you need to actually contact your Department of Enterprise Service Learning Center administrator to be able to allow your agency to access it in the Learning Center. But it is available on the Office of Privacy and Data Protection's website if you want to just watch the training. But I will caution that if your agency then decides to assign the training to you, you won't get credit for watching it on the internet. You'll just have to get a bonus training in the Learning Center if you take it in the Learning Center as well. Looks like Matt answered that question. Nicole has a question for the identify function. Has your office created a regulatory inventory? So no, we haven't done a regulatory for every single agency in the state of Washington. So we rely on our agencies to know which laws apply to them and how they need to follow them. But if you have questions about particular laws, we're happy to try and field those. A lot of the actual specific legal questions, of course, should be fielded by your assistant attorney generals. Other questions? So Matt or Jen, did you have anything to add to the materials that we discussed today?
I think that, yeah, I was going to say, I think that the way Washington is tackling the framework is a very approachable way for a lot of agencies who are getting started or scaling a privacy program to tackle.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. Yes, so that has been our intent. We're starting at a very high level. We are going to post the slide deck for today's webinar, the recording of the webinar, and then we will be posting the privacy framework as a resources, and it has all of the links that you see in the slide deck as well. And then at a later date, we're going to release more supplemental guidance for the implementation of the privacy framework. So this was just an introduction for everybody today and get the wheels turning and thinking about how to get started and how to use it. But of course, if you are at 201, 301, 401 level in your organization and you want supplemental guidance right away, then the NIST privacy framework is really where I would direct you. But what we were finding in just talking about the NIST privacy framework and trying to look at the framework for use for everybody right away, it is a little bit of an overwhelming tool. And so we wanted to boil it down to some more fundamental levels for our state. Okay, well, if there's nothing else today, I want to thank everybody for joining us for our webinar, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Jen. Bye, Matt.
Bye.